to this board. So again, I'd like to first hear from Mr. Ramsdell. Sure. Okay. All right. Mr. Mitchell, then.
Before you start, Mr. Mitchell, can I ask a few questions of the attorney? Yes.
Of him?
Yes. Would that be fine, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Okay. So, you, Mr. Mitchell, so you're here on behalf of Dexter Legg for the Planning Board.
I'm on behalf of the planning board, yes.
Did the Planning Board authorize you to represent them tonight in the hearing?
According to Mr. Legg, yes.
At a regularly scheduled
Yeah,
meeting?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I was contacted initially by Bob Sullivan, who had had conversations, I believe, with Mr. Legg and the city manager, and my hiring was authorized in that way.
Okay. And we voted to listen to you. I find this really highly unusual that an attorney for another land use board would come before the ZBA. It seems inappropriate. So, but please go ahead.
And I would agree with that. This kind of blindsided me when he popped in and said, "Hey, I represent the planning board." I'd like to know if the whole planning board voted to authorize him to appear on their behalf.
Well, I have.
Could somebody here speak to that?
You can ask Mr. Legg that, or but I have no way of answering that this evening.
Well, Mr. Sullivan's here. He can answer that.
Sure. Yeah, Mr. Sullivan. I don't know if you know the answer to that.
I'd be happy to answer any questions about it.
Sure. Thank you.
The facts were exactly as Attorney Mitchell just said. Chairman Legg requested of the city manager that the planning board be able to retain counsel. He specifically requested Attorney Mitchell, and I contacted Attorney Mitchell once the city manager had said to respond to that request positively of the request of Chairman Legg. And that's how Attorney Mitchell got to be here now.
Do you know if the whole planning board voted to do that, or
I
just
do
Mr.
not
Legg?
believe. I do not believe the whole planning board voted on it.
And I think him representing him is highly improper.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, Mr. Hageman, go ahead.
Attorney Sullivan, does the chair of the planning board is it within his purview or authority to make such a request and engage in such a hire, or would it have properly been that the board vote to do such an act?
Well, this is, as has been said a number of times, an unusual and unique situation. I don't believe it's ever happened in the past. So there is no established procedure as to how this would come about. I do think that the position of chairman carries with it significant authority. Chairman Legg has authority, and he certainly can make a request. The request could have been denied, I think, but it was not denied, and I think it's a legitimate pathway that has brought Attorney Mitchell here.
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Mr. Hageman.
Just as a follow-up to that, Attorney Sullivan, was the rest of the planning board notified that Attorney Mitchell would be coming and representing the board?
I do not know the answer to that question.
Do we know?
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. If there's, do you know, Mr. Stiff?
I do not know.
Okay. Okay.
Mr. Parrott, go ahead.
Yeah, I really have a major concern about this. For that reason that's just been expressed there. Plus, I've always, as long as I've been involved in this, I've always considered the city legal department, the boards, including this board's legal advisors. Now all of a sudden we have somebody from outside. What if you and he disagree? Who do we listen to? I got a real problem with this, because the city's legal department, tell me if I'm wrong, is the lawyer for the land use boards, including this one.
That's a correct statement. However, in a situation like this where you have a decision which was made by the planning board and then next a decision made by the Board of Adjustment, I think the duty of the city's legal department shifts. At the time when this question was in front of the planning board, the city legal department's duty was to provide legal assistance and advice to the planning board. After the question left the planning board and came to the Board of Adjustment, it becomes the responsibility and the duty of the city attorney's office to provide advice and assistance to the zoning board. And that's what we are doing right now. There is a real refinement, however, which is, I think, that Chairman Legg was interested in having arguments made on behalf of the planning board to the zoning board. Whereas what the city legal department provides to the zoning board now is advice, and if something further happens after you make a decision, representation in that case. We are not in the position or the role of making an argument to the zoning board on behalf of the planning board, because today we are not representing the planning board, we're representing the zoning board. And so if someone was going to make an argument on behalf of the planning board, it was going to have to be someone else.
Can I ask a follow-up in the same
Let
vein
me
after,
just,
after Mr.
Ms. Eldridge
I guess
first.
I would feel differently if he was representing the planning board. But the rest of the planning board, so far as we know, knows nothing. And while I think the chair of our land use boards has some power, I didn't know it went beyond running our meeting, setting agendas and that sort of thing. So I'm also uncomfortable with this.
Okay.
And if I could just follow up, sir, the planning board's record is what it is. That is what we are bound by, and that is what, even though we do if we decide to do a de novo review, it is what it is. It's not appropriate for one member of that board to supplement that record. I am very uncomfortable with this. I think if, to you, Chair, I would vote to not hear from Mr. Mitchell and just merely hear from Mr. Ramsdell and Mr. McCallum on the merits of whether or not we could hear the CUP. I think this is very inappropriate.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hageman, you wanted to say something else?
So sort of following on with the earlier questions and what you just said about how the planning board effectively wants or should have representation since you're providing guidance to the zoning board. If Attorney Mitchell, and again, no disrespect meant by these questions, Attorney Mitchell, I know you've been brought in as part of all this. I'm just, since we're talking about procedure and process, I think it's kind of important right now. And I guess I'm having a hard time understanding the distinction between Attorney Mitchell representing the planning board if he's hired by and paid for by the city.
Yes, Attorney Mitchell is hired by and would be paid for by the city.
Okay, so how is that different than you just providing guidance to both boards as opposed to having Attorney Mitchell who's paid for by the city?
Because at this moment, tonight, my duty is owed to the zoning board. And Attorney Mitchell is here on behalf of the planning board.
Okay.
So maybe what makes the most sense is, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, maybe what makes the most sense, given the general discomfort, is to hear from the respondents, and then to hear from the respondents' representative, and then to hear from the appellants, and then to open it up to members of the public. And Mr. Mitchell, if you want to speak, it sounds like we've got a good understanding of who you've been retained by, and what the backstory was in getting us to today. If you wanted to speak as a member of the public, I don't know what the rest of the board's thought is on that. I don't know why we would prohibit something like that.
I'd be willing to make a motion to that effect, that we disqualify Attorney Mitchell as a representative of the planning board until we have some evidence that he is the representative of the whole planning board. And if he wants to testify as a member of the public, I'm fine with that.
Well, my concern is that the respondent's attorney deferred to him to make their presentation. Who was going to?
I assume they'll. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume you'll be able to make a presentation, Mr. Ramsdell.
I did not defer to him to make my presentation. He had asked if he could go first because he was here on behalf of the he wanted to go first. I didn't say he was making my presentation.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood then, so.
Okay. I'm not sure if we need to go so far as to suggesting that anybody is disqualified, but maybe just in terms of who we're going to hear from and when, hear from the respondents, hear from the appellants, and then open it up to the public.
Unless the whole planning board voted to hire him as their attorney, then I think that would disqualify him on his face value.
Are
We
you
don't
suggesting
know
that
the
he
answer to
wouldn't
that.
be
That's
able
the
to speak
problem.
as a member of the public anymore?
Say again?
Are you
no.
suggesting he wouldn't be able
It's
to
not.
speak as a member of the public anymore?
He would be, yeah, he'd be a member, yeah, sure, he's a member of the public.
So, okay, so
Yeah,
that
that's
would
what
be
I
okay?
said, he would be
Okay.
able to speak as a member of the
Mr.
public.
Chairman, Attorney
Just not
Mitchell
as a representative
suggested
of the planning
that if what the zoning board would like is for a vote of the planning board to authorize him to appear, and since this meeting is going to be bifurcated, then perhaps we could get that vote from the entire planning board.
Okay, thank you. I don't know what people think about that, if it makes sense to Mr. Hageman.
I personally think that is fine, because A, we're not even to the merits of the case yet, and the question of whether we're the right forum is the next question that we're discussing, which I guess Attorney Mitchell could be speaking to that point on procedural, but if it's more to the merits of the case,
That's, by agreement with Mr. Sullivan's office, I will not be speaking to the merits.
okay.
I came here tonight only to address the jurisdictional issue.
Okay.
And I apologize that I'm not in a position to represent to you that the whole planning board is aware of this, but what I just discussed with Mr. Sullivan and he passed on to you is one possible solution.
I would urge the zoning board in some manner, way, shape, or another, to hear from Attorney Mitchell, to hear from him tonight. He is a recognized expert in this area. That's why he was retained by Chairman Legg. And the board would, of course, be free to disregard anything he might say, but the board might find something he says to be interesting and of value. So I would suggest you hear from him.
So
Thank you.
I think Mr.
hey,
Mitchell.
Hold 1 second, please. So, Mr. Sullivan, thank you. I'm not sure that it makes a difference who Mr. Mitchell is speaking on behalf of, if, as Mr. Sullivan is suggesting, if we hear from him as a member of the public, and we know how he came to be at the podium today, if we hear from him as a member of the public, we can agree with or disagree with anything he says and make the decision based on the merits of it. Go ahead, Ms. Marge.
I mean, it's fine if everyone wants to let poor Attorney Mitchell speak as a member of the public. I understand you're in a difficult position. I will say it is not up to the planning board to let the BOA know what we believe is within its jurisdiction. It is totally within our purview to determine that.
Which is why it probably makes sense to hear from him as a member of the public, and we can move on.
Mr. Acting Chair, can I make
Yeah,
a motion?
Mr. Hageman.
I would have said the opposite.
So I would move that we hear from the representatives of the two parties and Mr. Mitchell as a member of the public in the nature of his expertise as opposed to a representative of the planning board.
Okay, can I have a second for that motion? Second. Yeah, Mr. Lee, thank you. Any discussion on that?
Sure, I like beating dead horses.
You don't, feel free not to if you don't want to.
Based on the conversation we've had and the lack of understanding of how the planning board fits into this piece and the representation of who's representing the city to the zoning board and the planning board and where Mr. Mitchell fits in, given the number of questions around that, I think it'd be more appropriate if we heard from him as a member of the public as opposed to a representative of the planning board.
Great, okay. Mr. Lee, your second.
You know, I find it pretty audacious of the planning board chairman to go on his own initiative, apparently, to hire a lawyer without the knowledge of his fellow planning board members. So, you know, this whole thing is really starting to come, seem really strange.
Okay, okay, thank
So
you.
that's my second.
Well,
Any discussion from any board members?
What happens when you don't agree?
Ms. Eldred? Sorry, Ms. Margison.
I think I will vote in favor of this just to move this along, because it's really the Mr. Ramsdell and Mr. McCallum that we'll be hearing from. I am personally not in favor of having the attorney speak as a member of the public, but again, if it just gets to us speaking with the applicants, with the parties before us, I mean, it's fine with me. So I find this very inappropriate.
Okay. Any other comments from any other board members? Okay. I'm just going to take a voice vote. All in favor of Mr. Hageman's motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And the vice chair votes aye as well. Okay. So, in terms of order of participation here, we'll again hear from Mr. Ramsdell. Thank you for bearing with us here. We'll hear from Mr.